wondering where everyone is. That's probably what it is, Tim. Oh, well, right side, left church showed up today at least. Looks pretty good to my right. I was wondering where Judy was. Judy Jones is always here at this time, and I don't see her anywhere. Oh, well. I just heard that Ethel Hendershot's supposed to be discharged from Heartland and returned to apartment Thursday. And Kurt has all the other announcements because I'm drawing a blank at the moment. And by the way, the board announces the birth of Jeremy and Kristen Antle's daughter. Kristen is spelled with an I, not an E, but it's going to be an E on the board because I got the information late Friday, and I asked Tracy, Kristen with an E, Kristen with an I, and she said, I'll get back to you. Well, she got back to me too late, so you can change it on your announcement sheet if you like, Kurt. Not that anybody's going to see that, but I know it's not right, so if you notice, it's okay. We're going to pick up our study this morning, world geography and ancient biblical history, with the nation of Assyria. I think we finished Egypt last week, and I was noticing when I went back over my notes, I cut and paste. I keep changing this and reformatting. I saw where Egypt had shot down a Russian plane. I thought, well, that's not right. That was Turkey. So scratch that out if you have the handout. I keep moving things around because I'm trying to get some order to our study, and I don't know if it's working or not. I'm looking at ancient history and modern geography from the perspective of how history unfolds in relationship to Israel. And it's Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, the Medo-Persians, then the Greeks under Alexander, followed by the Romans. And so that's the process that we're following. I don't know how effective it is. We typically begin our class with prayer, David, so if you would mind doing that. Amen. All right. Wow. That's not showing up very well, but this is Kuwait. This is Iraq. Baghdad is the capital. Mosul's up in this area. Basra's down in this area. And, of course, Jordan to the west, as well as Israel. Syria, major border. Iran is over in this area. Tehran is their capital. And this is the Persian Gulf. This is the Sinai Peninsula down in here. And we've already looked at Egypt and the Sinai, and we've explained how Egypt and Israel have had reasonably good relations since about 1982, but recent events in Egypt have kind of brought about a decline in that relationship with the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood and all that was involved with the Arab Spring. But when we talk about modern Iraq, we're really focusing on ancient Assyria. Now again, another picture of Iraq that may show up a little better. I don't know the printing's kind of blurry, but I want you to put things in perspective. We looked at Saudi Arabia primarily because of Islam, and I wanted to set the stage for the things that are going on relative to the Muslim world. Saudi Arabia is mentioned only 7 times in the entire text of Scripture. It doesn't play a really remarkable role, but remember, most of Saudi Arabia is just desert. This is the ancient Assyrian Empire in biblical days. As you can see, it reached all the way down into Egypt and encompassed all of Palestine, modern Iraq, much of Iran, all the way down to the Persian Gulf. And Sumer is one of the oldest cultures in the world. They go back several millennium and were part of the territory that the Assyrian Empire imposed. They were an enemy of Israel during the days of the divided kingdom. Now, when we talk about biblical history, it falls generally under 12 headings. And most of you, we've gone through this before, know those headings, but I'll just very quickly recount them for you. Before the flood, after the flood, patriarchal, Egyptian bondage, wilderness wanderings, conquest, judges, united kingdom, and then divided kingdom, which is the period in which Assyria raises its ugly head. And I say ugly head because the Assyrian Empire was probably one of the most brutal of any of the empires that we read about in biblical history or history in general. They bragged about their treatment of conquered peoples. The Persian Empire was the opposite. They tried to placate fears. They took captives that had been transplanted and returned them to their homelands. They allowed freedom of religion. The Assyrians, on the other hand, would really brag about piling the skulls of their enemies into huge mountains. And they would, and I know this is not pleasant to contemplate, but they would literally skin human flesh as we would skin a deer, and then use the skin in various ways. That was the nature of the Assyrian Empire that posed a real threat to the kingdom of Israel during this period of Israel and Judah. They defeated Israel and took the Israelites captive. And you can read about this in 2 Kings 17. And when they did so, they destroyed the city of Samaria. Samaria had been built by Omri. The first king of Israel was Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. And it was Jeroboam followed by a series of 20 monarchs, all total, from about 922 to 722. The most familiar king of Israel to most people is Ahab, who married Jezebel, and Ahab and Jezebel are just synonymous with wickedness and unfaithfulness and idolatry. Omri, Jeroboam, Nadab, Baasha, Elah, Zimri, Omri, Ahab. Omri was Ahab's father, and he built Samaria as the capital of the northern kingdom, and it fell in 722 BC at the hands of the Assyrians. Now, what's really interesting about this, and if you continue to read in chapter 17, we'll read that in a moment, it comes into play in the New Testament. But after defeating the northern kingdom, Assyria came to the walls of Jerusalem. And I've cited here the account in Isaiah. There are certainly other narratives that deal with it in the Old Testament, but you get a really good picture of what happened. Representatives of the king of Assyria stood on the outside of the wall and spoke up to the Israelites who were manning the wall. And they essentially said, you tell Hezekiah, who was king of Judah at the time, that God's not going to deliver him. And by the way, he can't trust in Egypt, and we pointed this out a week or two ago. That's like a man leaning on a staff, and the staff is pointed and it goes through his hand. Egypt's not going to help you. They're only going to hurt you. You're done. But Hezekiah was a good king, and he turned to God, and God, through the prophet Isaiah, told the king that they would be delivered. There would be a rumor of trouble back home, and God would also intervene and destroy a large portion of the army, and the threat would evaporate, which is exactly what happened. So Assyria defeated the northern kingdom, came very close to defeating the southern kingdom till God intervened and protected Judah. But back to this idea of Assyria again, you know Assyria and the empire well also because of Nineveh and the book of Jonah. Jonah was dispatched by God to preach to the city of Nineveh. This would have been, Nineveh fell around 611, and this would have been about 140 years earlier. Jonah, you go to Nineveh and you tell them, yet 40 days and Nineveh perishes. You either repent or perish. Some people say turn or burn. It's the idea that Jonah is preaching, and he doesn't want to do it. Now, think about that for a moment. God is about to destroy the capital of the Assyrian Empire, the enemy of God's people. Do you want to go there and preach a message that might result in their deliverance? Or would you rather God just step in and destroy them? Well, I think the answer from a human perspective is pretty obvious. If we're just thinking as human beings, well, I don't want Nineveh spared. Let God wipe them off the face of the map. Kind of the attitude that people, I suspect, have toward North Korea right now. I don't know that anybody would shed a lot of tears if that fat little guy who rules that kingdom, and he rules it as a kingdom, was taken out of the picture. Well, that's how Jonah viewed Nineveh, and therefore not wanting to go because he knew the power of his message, and he knew the promise of God. When people repent, God repents of the threats he's leveled. So he goes in the opposite direction. In fact, all the way towards Spain is his goal. About as far away at that time as he can get from where he was supposed to be. But as you know, God wouldn't let him shirk his duty. He went, preached, and Nineveh was spared. In fact, for another 140 years or so. And then finally, when you think of Assyria in the New Testament, of course the Assyrians are completely out of the picture by the time Jesus comes on the scene, but the remnants of what they were able to accomplish can be seen in the Samaritans. And you go back to 2 Kings 17 and begin, I think, in verse 20 and read through the close of the text. Well, 24 through 41. I was off 3 verses or 4. Start in verse 24 and read through the remainder of the text, and you find out why the Samaritans existed in the first century. When the Assyrians defeated Israel, they took Israelites captive, and they resettled people from the area that is generally identified as Babylon. But things didn't fare well with them. And the response was, well, they're worshiping the wrong God. They need the God of this land. And so a Levitical priest was brought to these resettled people in Samaria and instituted a form of Jewish worship. They used only the first 5 books of the Old Testament. They're called the Samaritan Pentateuch. And rather than Jerusalem, they selected Mount Gerizim, not Mount Zion, as their central place of worship. And they built a temple there and engaged in worship up until essentially the Romans destroyed the Jewish nation, and with it, the Samaritans fell apart as well. But over and over again, Jesus interacts with Samaritans. When he speaks of them in a very favorable way, as he does in Luke 10 when he tells the story of the Good Samaritan. But these folks exist because of the Assyrian invasion, the conquest, the captivity, the importing of foreigners, and then the Levitical priest sent to teach them aspects of the law to make things go a little more smoothly. So if you ever wonder where, when you read the New Testament, the Samaritans came from, this is the background for that. Also, I'd point out to you that the Jews had such a strong distaste for the Samaritans that they would avoid traveling through Samaria if at all possible. New Testament Palestine was divided into three regions: Galilee to the north, Samaria in the middle, and of course Judah to the south. And they would frequently, those who were coming to Jerusalem for any of the great feasts, would travel down the eastern side of the Jordan River. They would go east of the Sea of Galilee and then south along the Jordan River until they could cross into Judah and thus avoid Samaria. There was such strong distaste. This is a map of the Assyrian deportation. It begins in Samaria here. This is the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, and of course the Dead Sea. And Israelites were taken all the way into Media. And Amos, contemporary, writes of their being deported, actually led away with rings in their noses, much like you might lead an animal. Again, the Assyrians were not nice people. But because of the problems that developed here, they always deported and then resettled. They brought folks from over in this region and resettled them here, but that didn't go well until the priest was brought on the scene. Now, let's look at modern history as it relates to this part of the world. War between Iraq and Iran, that started in 1980 in September and ran through 1988. Pardon me for getting a parenthesis there. I don't know what happened. I thought I changed that. Iraq invaded Kuwait in August of 1990. Y'all remember that? Kuwait is the little nation at the very bottom of the map showing Iraq. And Saddam wanted it, Saddam Hussein, and so he invaded. Most of us remember that vividly. If you're young, probably not so much. And that was followed then by a coalition of several countries under the leadership. Greg's grinning back there because I had trouble with coalition. Under Bush 41, this coalition was formed, and in short order, they retook Kuwait and started their drive toward Baghdad. Now, some today would argue that had they finished what they set out to do then, much of what followed under Bush 43 would not have happened. But I think about halfway to Baghdad, they called it off. The war ended, and Saddam Hussein remained in power. As a result, under Bush 43, there was a second invasion of Iraq. This one was to deal with weapons of mass destruction, which, according to all intel from all over the world, Saddam Hussein had amassed in Iraq. Now, Bush 43 gets a lot of flack today because when the invasion was complete, the war had ended, these weapons of mass destruction were not found. It's possible that they're still buried in the sand over there. It's possible that they were moved out of Iraq prior to the invasion. It's quite possible they never existed and all the intel agencies just got it wrong. But he was acting on the best information intelligence at the time. Now, this is not a debate about whether he was a good president or a bad president, that was a good war or a bad war. I'm just simply saying the motivation was to deal with weapons of mass destruction. The weapons were never found, and so there are many today who argue that that was a war that should not have been fought. Yet at the time, everyone believed that those weapons existed, and we know from history that Saddam Hussein was not in any way reluctant to use them. He used them against his own people, and he used them against Iran. And we'll talk at some point very briefly about the Iran-Iraq War, which interestingly, we were on the side of Iraq in that. The same nation that ultimately was invaded twice, justifiably it seems, but nonetheless, our ally became our enemy. The Iraqi nation was liberated, Saddam was captured, and eventually he was executed. Democracy was initiated. Under Obama, the U.S. withdrew nearly all of their forces, and shortly thereafter, you see the rise of ISIS and the development of what they call the new caliphate, with its capital in Raqqa, encompassing Syria and a large portion of Iraq. Right now, there's an effort underway to retake Mosul. Iraq, under the Ottoman Empire, was divided into three provinces. Mosul to the north, Baghdad in the center, and Basra to the south. And what we're seeing now is an effort to retake that northern province where Mosul is the primary city. And it's extremely valuable because of the oil that's found there. In fact, you can go back in history and see references long before anybody knew that oil was valuable, that it just simply bubbled up near Mosul. There were large pools available. And one of the reasons the British were so interested in this part of the world was because it was common knowledge that this was a land with vast oil reserves. And that played an important part in what happened following World War I and the divisions that we've talked about, and how lines were drawn in the sand without regard to peoples and their religions, and it's been an ongoing battle ever since. The Syrian civil war is underway at this time, and of course that led to the rise of ISIS. And ISIS is a movement to go back to the Quran, to interpret it literally, and to establish a caliphate, which is, in their vision, a world government. They're not interested in just establishing borders within a nation and living then in peace. They really believe that their purpose is to dominate the world. They want to take the message of Muhammad around the globe, and they really do argue that it's either you convert or you die. And the only way to deal with these folks is to confront them and eliminate them. And I know from a Christian perspective that seems pretty harsh, but if you look at, again, Old Testament history, what did God do with nations that were so decadent, so vile, and so inhumane that they were beyond redemption? He eliminated them. Do you know how to get rid of all of the evil in the world today? I'm being serious. Do you know how to do that? You have to kill everybody. That's just the facts of the matter. There's evil that has to be eliminated. And ISIS is that kind of evil. It's not that they would be content to live within their borders. They want to expand those borders continuously until it encompasses the world, and they will do it by any means available. They use small children, women. They're not concerned about innocence. To them, death is victory. Die in jihad brings you into the presence of Allah and those 72 virgins, and so death offers no fear to them. In fact, they live to die in the name of Allah so that they can go on to glory. And frankly, that's about the only way to eliminate them. We're not comfortable, at least a lot of us are not comfortable with that, but it's the reality. When God sent Saul to the Amalekites, what did he tell them? Tell Saul, 1 Samuel 15, utterly destroy them. They were beyond redemption. And I would suggest to you that they were worse than ISIS. And God knew the only way to deal with them was to destroy them. He made them. They were His people like all of us. He has the right to make whatever decree He chooses to be in the best interest of His plan. And in that regard, it was pretty clear cut. And when people think that we can wage war without killing anybody, I don't think they understand war. And we've been trying to wage war for some time now without killing people, blowing up stuff. Isn't that what war is all about? As unpleasant as it is, that's what it's about. And we're so careful now that our men and women in uniform are really limited in what they can do. And I have no doubt that many, many, many have died or been wounded seriously because of the limitations placed on them to do a job, and then they're not permitted to use the resources available to do it. Do you want to see people killed? Again, no. But sometimes the only way to eliminate a threat is to eliminate it. All right. You go from Assyria to Babylon, and you're still in the same territory. If you notice, this is the Babylonian Empire, and again, it encompasses nearly the same territory that the Assyrian Empire encompassed, and we're still primarily in modern Iraq. The Assyrians were defeated by the Babylonians. The city of Nineveh fell, their capital, around 611. And the Babylonians then expanded, and they reached all the way into Egypt again, south of Thebes, and encompassed the entire region of Mesopotamia and all of Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, and were a major force for approximately 200 years. What did we say last week about the average life of a nation? 200 years on average. And you look at how biblical history plays out, and that's pretty much what you see. There are exceptions, but that's pretty much what you see. The Assyrians were defeated, and I believe that they were defeated because God had a hand in it. When I look at history, and in particular biblical history, I see the role of God in accomplishing His purpose. You recall in Romans chapter 13 that Paul wrote that the powers that be are ordained of God, that God is in control, and He will accomplish His purpose. He will work things out so that His ultimate will is accomplished. Now, His will is not simply to raise one nation above another. His will is to bring about the redemption of His creation. He was to do that through the person of His only begotten Son, who would come into this world through the descendants, the lineage of Abraham. The whole story of biblical history is about how God accomplishes this purpose. And each of these nations, Egypt and Assyria and Babylon and Persia, they all play a crucial role in the ultimate fulfillment of God's promise in Genesis 3:15 to bless all people through the seed of the woman. And that, of course, was a direct reference to Jesus. Now, in relationship to the Babylonian Empire, the Assyrians were defeated and Nineveh destroyed. The Babylonians eventually destroyed Jerusalem. What most folks don't realize is that there were 3 invasions of the Babylonians into Jerusalem. And it begins in 606, and then 597, and then finally in 586 BC. This time the city is just leveled, the temple is destroyed, and all of value was taken to Babylon. There are certain dates in biblical history that you need to really focus on, and of course one of them is 586 BC. This was the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. But the first invasion was in 606. What had God prophesied regarding Judah and Babylon? That they would spend 70 years in captivity. If you begin at 586 and go to 536, that's not 70 years. But if you take the first invasion, and from that point forward, anyone in Judah who rules as a puppet of Babylon. Therefore, the captivity began in 606. I believe then that's Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and continues. There's rebellion, another invasion in 597, and then continued rebellion in 586. The Babylonians just said, we're done, and they destroyed everything. But those taken captive, beginning in 606, would remain in captivity until 736. And in 736, the Babylonians are out of the picture, and the Persians, the Medo-Persian Empire, is now the dominant force. And their philosophy, as I mentioned earlier, was the opposite of the Assyrians. The Assyrians and the Babylonians would conquer, and then they would uproot and resettle in other conquered territories so that people were removed from their homeland and resettled. And the Persians took the opposite position. They took people that had been uprooted and allowed them to return to their homes and their homeland. And in the case of Israel, at government expense. And their capital and their temple, which were destroyed, would be rebuilt at government expense. So it's an entirely different philosophy. I find that ironic given the attitude that exists in Persia today, which is Iran. And they're very quick to tell you that they are Persian, because during the Persian Empire, that region really dominated the world. And it's interesting how people keep wanting to go back to a time that has long since passed them by. I believe Israel wants to become what she was under David and Solomon. The likelihood of that is extremely limited because Israel served her purpose. She was a people and a nation for the arrival of Christ. He has come. He has accomplished His purpose. And so if you want to know the true Israel of God today, read Galatians 6, 15 and 16. It's the church, spiritual Israel. And there is nothing in Scripture to support or sustain the idea that Israel as a nation back in Palestine is essential to the fulfillment of biblical prophecy and the accomplishment of God's will. Jeremiah, Daniel, Ezekiel all fit into this time period of the Babylonian Empire and its attacks on Judah. Babylon in the New Testament, by the way, is used essentially only in a symbolic sense. You'll find it in 1 Peter and also in Revelation, but I don't believe that it was intended to be seen in the literal sense of this region of the world, but rather represents, in one case, and perhaps both, Rome as a modern Babylon, and the symbolism is that it's a decadent, immoral society destined to fall. And in relationship to the Romans who set out to destroy or eradicate Christianity, what ultimately happened is that Rome fell to Christians. And there are a lot of reasons why that is. I read an interesting article a couple of weeks ago that took the position that the church continued to grow and numbers increase while Romans continued to decline and decay. And the author of this article, I have it in my file, I just don't remember it at this time, made the argument that Rome in the first century did not respect marriage and family, that there was no real regard for children. In Roman society, children that were deformed, defective at childbirth were simply tossed away, as we would toss away a can of tomato soup. Once we've emptied the soup out, we throw the can away. That's how they looked at children. And, they plunged the knife into sickly cattle, and we just discard our children. Furthermore, they valued males much more than females. The estimate is in the first century in Roman culture, there were 137 to 43 men for every 100 women. And you can imagine that that's going to limit the number of children that are being reproduced. Furthermore, homosexuality, if you think it's bad now, folks, it was a whole lot worse then. I'm not even going to tell you what some of the emperors did relative to that issue. Men didn't value women, they didn't value commitment, they didn't value children, and a culture like that is not going to reproduce. It's going to continue to decline numerically, while Christians who valued all life, who married for life, who gave birth to children and raised them in the faith, continued to grow and grow and grow. And the explanation is that by the 4th century, Christians were in so much the majority that Rome could not survive. And it makes perfect sense when you look at how things unfolded. I get the comment all the time that, this world is just getting more and more wicked, and I can't believe God's going to wait much longer. And when we say that, I think we're indicating that we don't have a real grasp of how bad it can get. It's bad, and it's probably going to get a lot worse because it's been a whole lot worse before. That's where the faithful remnant, the church, we have to raise our heads and stand up for truth and model Christianity, live it, and then teach it, and be prepared to pay the price when people object. And they most definitely will. Now, let's very quickly today look at Mosul. The battle right now is to take Mosul from ISIS. I bring this up simply because it's in the news, and I want to make this as up to date as I can. There's a coalition right now. I got it right, Greg, that time. And this coalition of Iraqi army and police units and militia from the Islamic State and others are working together to drive ISIS out of Mosul. And I would point out that the Kurdish Peshmerga are heavily involved. One of the problems in that region of the world is that there are all these ethnic groups, and the Kurds don't get along with the Turks or the Iraqis, and they are tough fighters. And the United States has tried to aid them and encourage them, not nearly to the extent that probably we should, but there's been some reluctance because one of the earliest members of NATO was Turkey, and of course the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is duty bound when one is attacked, all come to the rescue, and the Kurds and the Turks don't get along, so if you help the Kurds, the Turks get angry, but if you don't help them, their enemies are going to have success, and they're a far better ally than enemy. The First Crusade, in the First Crusade, Mosul was a staging ground for Muslim counterattacks. We're going back to the Middle Ages then. The ultra-soft and light fabric called muslin, I wouldn't know muslin if I saw it, but I've heard about it all my life, derives its name from Mosul. Not that it was made there, but Mosul was a shipping capital to Europe for just centuries and centuries, well over a millennium. And I thought you might make that connection. With the end of the Ottoman Empire, Mosul, along with Baghdad and Basra, were the three Ottoman provinces which form modern Iraq today. Now, this is a picture of a supporter of ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq, the Levant. And I didn't recognize that word. It originally meant east. It has both French and Italian derivations, but stands now for Syria-Palestine. So if you see something about the Levant, it's the region of Syria-Palestine. He's in Raqqa, Syria, this fella holding that black flag. Raqqa is the so-called capital of the caliphate. This is Mosul in the time of the First Crusades. And just a map to show you how things played out. Mosul was a prominent city way back then. Then you have the Ottoman Empire, and once more, Mosul is part, as is Iraq, of that empire. Aleppo, by the way, is here in Syria. Aleppo has been in the news of late because it's just being pounded by Bashar Assad and the Syrian forces, and those folks are unconcerned about loss of life, and they take no precautions at all. This is what was envisioned in 1916. I told you about the Sykes-Picot agreement between the French and the British in the middle of World War, leading up to World War I. They were going to divide this land among themselves, and they had another agreement with Russia that was slightly different, and they were simply interested in expanding empires, taking land, enjoying the resources of that land. This agreement, by the way, was never carried out. This is another map of the same agreement, just I thought it was a little clearer. You see the Russians, the French, the Italians. Palestine was to be under international control, ultimately went to Britain, and Britain led the way in the Zionist movement to return Jews to Palestine, reestablish the Jewish state, and we'll talk about that later when we get to that. And this is the Turkish claims in 1920, the end of World War II, or World War I, pardon me, and the Ottoman Empire has fallen. And again, Aleppo and Mosul are important cities in that period. And finally, this is the last map because I did hear the bell. I want you to see what we're dealing with here in terms of makeup. You've got the Assad regime. This is the pink stuff. This is where Assad in Syria seems to have control. All of the white is Islamic State. Well, this lighter, kind of grayish white. And then the Sunnis are here. And the Kurdish, they're the green up in this area, and they border Turkey. And so the Kurdish and the Turkey folks are always fighting about this border. And then the Iraqi government's over here. And you get all of these folks involved. They don't get along with each other at all. And what do you get? Exactly what we have right now. And that's where we have to quit. Next week, we'll begin with Iran, which is ancient Persia. And if you get the handouts,